Good afternoon and welcome to the 7th installment of the Alliance's COVID-19 webinar series, Federal Funding to Address Homelessness and COVID-19, Ask the Experts. I'm Mindy Mitchell, a Senior Technical Assistance Specialist here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'm happy to moderate today's webinar. Our panel of experts today will include Steve Berg, Vice President for Programs and Policy at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Roxy Keynes, Get It Back, EITC Campaign Director at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and Jerry Jones, National Field Director at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I have just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and all registrants for this webinar will receive an email with an accompanying link to the recording, the slides, and additional resources within 24 hours of this broadcast. All attendees are on mute and will remain so throughout the broadcast, and all video functions have been turned off for attendees. Additionally, the Zoom chat function has been disabled, but if you have questions, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be held until after all presentations are complete, and then there will be a time for Q&A in which all panelists will participate. Any questions that we don't get to will be gathered by Alliance staff and will be included on the Ending Homelessness Forum, which I'll talk about some more in just a few minutes. The Alliance will continue its COVID-19 webinar series next week when we will host a webinar on how to do effective advocacy in a pandemic with our own National Field Director, Jerry Jones, and special guests from the field. As a reminder, you can access resources and sign up for future webinars on the Alliance's webinar series page. Additionally, if you haven't seen the announcements yet, our partners at the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council will be hosting a very important town hall discussion tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on how best to respond to clients who are having trouble adhering to isolation requirements so that you can avoid civil detention or involuntary commitments. You can join this really important conversation at the registration link on this slide. Finally, if you haven't already, please sign up for our Ending Homelessness Forum, a place for communities to obtain information on federal funding and guidance on the COVID-19 homeless response. You can also share information about the successes and emerging promising practices, as well as questions for each other on how to confront common challenges that communities and programs are facing during this crisis. Now, to start today's webinar, I'd like to introduce Roxy Keynes from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
Hello.
Hi, Roxy.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to have an opportunity to share about economic impact payments and the basics about what they are and who's eligible and how you can help people get them. So we'll start with what are economic impact payments. So you may hear them referred to as stimulus checks or recovery rebates or even stimulus payments. And these are all referring to the same thing. The economic impact payments is the official name that the IRS uses, and it is a key provision of the CARES Act legislation that Congress passed to help reduce the financial stress for a wide variety of individuals and families. So the payments are a temporary tax credit, and they are in advance of a tax credit that is for 2020. Since we're still in the middle of 2020, we would normally file our taxes for 2021, and so it is an advance of this credit. The credit is non-taxable money, and if someone is eligible for a tax refund next year, getting this credit, getting the economic impact payment will not reduce or change their refund in the future. And as non-taxable money, people do not need to pay it back. Also, this payment will not impact any other federal benefits like Medicaid, SNAP, or TANF. So now let's look at who's eligible for the economic impact payments and how much are they worth. So we'll start with the payment value. The payments are worth up to $1,200 for individuals or $2,400 for married couples who are filing jointly. And there's an additional payment available of up to $500 for each qualifying child. And we'll look at what a qualifying child is shortly. So now let's look at the income requirements that are associated with the payments. So one important thing to know is that there is no minimum income required. So if someone has zero earnings, they can still get this payment. The full amount of the payment is based on adjusted gross income. And for individuals, they can have income up to $7,500. Married filing jointly, it's up to $150,000. People with earnings higher than these amounts can still get a payment. It will just be less. And then the payment caps and is no longer available for people who are earning more than $99,000 if individuals and more than $198,000 if they are married filing jointly. These people may still be able to get the, that point actually belongs somewhere else. So please ignore that bullet. So another requirement is Social Security numbers. Social Security numbers are required for both the tax filer and spouse if married, as well as children. And if it's a military couple, only one person needs to have the Social Security number. For children, they must have a Social Security number or an adoption taxpayer identification number. And so a child must be considered a qualifying child for the payment. A qualifying child for the payment is a dependent who is under age 17. So a qualifying child for the economic impact payments is different from some other requirements for filing tax returns and other tax credits. If someone is a dependent and they're over 17, then that $500 is not available. If someone is claimed as a dependent on a tax return, then that person can't get the payment for themselves. So if someone is maybe 21 and they are earning money on their own and they already are filing a tax return, but they have a guardian or parent who is claiming them as a dependent, then they wouldn't be able to get the payment for themselves. Also, the Social Security number requirement means that people who have ITINs are not eligible for the payment. Now, if a child has an ITIN and the parent has a Social Security number, then they could still get the payment for themselves, but they wouldn't get that $500 for the child. So now let's look at how do people get economic impact payments. The IRS will calculate and send payments automatically for some people. So this includes people who already filed a 2018 or 2019 tax return. And now we're very happy that this next bullet, the list has grown. And so people receiving Social Security, railroad retirees, social SSDI, SSI, and VA beneficiaries will also get automatic payments. So they don't need to do anything. Other people will need to take action, and they will need to take one of two actions. One is file a 2019 tax return if someone is required to do so, or if they may benefit for other reasons because they may be eligible for the earned income tax credit or other tax filing benefits. The tax filing deadline has been extended to July 15th. People will just want to file this return as soon as possible because that means they'll get the payment more quickly. The second action that may need to be taken by a group of people is to complete a simple form. And this simple form is for non-filers, people who don't have a tax filing requirement, would not benefit from filing a tax return either. And so they can go to this website on the IRS's page to enter some basic information. Now, the form does require an email address to create an account. It's not an email address where the IRS will be sending information and updates. It's more to confirm that the form was submitted successfully. And so if someone doesn't have an email address, then someone else could use an email address to help them to create the account to submit the form. The form asks information about the tax filer, such as social security number, address. It also asks for information about qualifying dependents as well. And submitting this form is submitting a tax return for the purpose of getting the economic impact payment. So some non-filers may benefit from filing a tax return, as I mentioned earlier. And the tax filing threshold for 2019 for single people, if they have income above $14,200 and married filing jointly is above $24,400. So if people have earnings less than this, they may want to actually file a tax return because they may be eligible for the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit. There also may be some state and local tax credits that they may be eligible for as well. So with the payments, the IRS will deliver the payments through direct deposit or by mailing a paper check. So now I want to share a bit about common challenges that I've been hearing about and that you may be thinking about too. So we're going to look at the challenges of people not having a bank account. We'll also look at the challenges of people who haven't filed taxes recently. And then we'll look at the challenge of people who have had recent address changes. So for people who don't have a bank account, so here are the options to get economic impact payments overall. Direct deposit will allow someone to get their payment in the quickest and safest manner. And so ways to get direct deposit include through a bank account. And some people don't have bank accounts. They've never had bank accounts. Others have had them and have had them closed for various reasons. The Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund has partnered with a group called Bank On, and they are looking at ways to establish affordable and safe bank accounts that meet national standards. And there is a list available that you can look at if someone wants to open an account. Some of these accounts on this list, they don't have the same type of requirements and background screenings that other bank accounts do. Credit unions are also another example of a place where someone could establish a new bank account that will be more aligned for people who maybe have had challenges with financial institutions in the past. So in addition to bank accounts, people can use direct deposit through a prepaid debit card. And prepaid debit cards are now available in an increasing number of places. Drugstores sell them, and they're often offered through commercial tax preparers when they're filing tax returns too. The fees vary greatly with these cards, and so it's something that if you want to be able to share certain cards, you want to do research just to see what's available. The cards that are offered through commercial tax preparers are going to have higher fees. So the fees is one of the main challenges or barriers with these prepaid cards. For people who need the money urgently and have a lot of needs for spending it, then some of the fees that are associated with these accounts may not be as relevant. For example, some accounts may have monthly maintenance fees, but if someone already knows that and knows exactly how they're going to spend their payment and they would be spending it within 1 month, then maybe those fees aren't as relevant. Another way that direct deposit can be delivered is through Cash App. And Cash App has a whole page dedicated to sharing how people can get their economic impact payments using Cash App. So if someone doesn't have direct deposit, the IRS will go ahead and issue a paper check for people to get their payments. Now, another concern with bank accounts is inactive bank accounts. So what happens if someone has filed their tax return already and they no longer use the account that they listed on the tax return for direct deposit? Well, in that case, the return would be rejected and it would go back to the IRS, and so the IRS would issue a paper check. If somebody already knows that the account is not active, they can use a tool on the IRS's site that I'll share the address for later. It's called Get My Payment. And with that tool, one of the options is to update your bank account information. Now, whether or not this will be beneficial for people, it just depends on the timing. For some people, the IRS may have already attempted to deliver the payment to the account on file. And so now updating the address, updating the banking information won't help because that return is already in the queue for a paper check. So that is the process for if someone's account is no longer active. Now, there also has come up this concept of borrowing a bank account. If someone doesn't have a bank account and doesn't want to get one, then they just want to use a friend's bank account and have their payment deposited in their account and get it from their friend later. Well, this will also trigger a reject because the taxpayer's name must match the information on the bank account. So if it doesn't, the same thing will happen where it's rejected, it will go back to the IRS, and then a paper check will need to be issued, and this will delay the process. So keeping these things in mind will help people to get their payments more quickly. So now we can look at the challenge of people who haven't filed taxes recently. There are two groups generally that people may fall in. One is that people may owe money and they know they owe money. If they owe back taxes, student loan debt, or are on an IRS installment plan and are thinking, I don't want the IRS to take all my money because then I can't use it, then this category is safe. The IRS is prohibited from taking economic impact payments for any of these purposes. If someone owes child support, they can have that payment intercepted. And so that means that depending on how much child support is owed, either all or part of the economic impact payment may go towards child support. So that's on the federal level. For private creditors and financial institutions, there aren't regulations that were built in to this provision of the CARES Act. So there are some private creditors that have been reported that will be garnishing payments that are delivered into a bank account if someone has an outstanding court judgment. Also, some financial institutions have been taking the payments if someone owes money on overdraft fees. And there's just a lot of variety with this. There are some financial institutions, the larger ones, that are saying we're not going to do that for at least 90 days. But some of the smaller ones, they don't care as much. So this is something else just to be aware of. And if someone says that they got their payment, but it was less than it should have been, this could be a reason why. So another group of people who haven't filed taxes recently probably need help. Maybe they know that they need to file taxes, but they just don't know where to get started. And so there are some resources for help. Volunteer income tax assistance sites, also known as VITA, offer free high-quality tax preparation for people earning less than about $56,000, and volunteers are IRS certified annually. Due to COVID-19, the COVID-19 outbreak, most VITA sites have closed. Some VITA sites are offering virtual services, and others are looking at ways to reopen when physical distancing requirements end. So to find a VITA site, you can look at this website, getyourrefund.org, and by looking at the VITA sites in your area, you can see which sites, you can contact sites to see who's open or to find out who's offering virtual services. This website also allows people to file a tax return virtually. So people can submit their documents, if there are documents, through taking a picture with their cell phone. This is a partnership between an organization and the Internal Revenue Service to look at ways to expand remote tax filing services. So that's another option. There's also free online tax filing platforms, myfreetaxes.com. They also have a helpline associated for someone to file their taxes on their own. And then IRS Free File, there are several different tax software companies that have software available for people to file their own taxes for free. And then finally, there are some local organizations and agencies that recognize how challenging this can be for people, and so are looking at how they can just do it, help people, mainly with the non-filer form, how they can just do it for people so that they don't have to try to navigate it on their own. So those are some ways that people can get help. So now onto the challenge of address changes. So two groups of people, again, people who have moved since filing a 2019 tax return. The best thing that people can do if they want to get their refund as a paper check is to update their address through the post office. The IRS coordinates with the Postal Service's database on address changes. So if someone updates their address that way, then the IRS is likely to get it. If someone wants their refund faster though, they can just update some information to have their payment directly deposited into an account. The other group of people with address changes or address concerns are people who lack a permanent mailing address. And so their main options for this group are to use the address of a trusted family member or friend, or to find an organization or agency that allows people to use their address to receive mail. And there are several different types of groups that do this. These include shelters, healthcare clinics, drop-in day centers, community action agencies, and Salvation Armies have also done this. And even some churches have done this as well. So the lack of a permanent mailing address does not need to be a barrier. And the IRS will deliver checks and notices to PO boxes as well. So that is fine for someone to have. So just a few other things that you'll want to know and be able to share. For tracking payments, people can use the Get My Payment tool that I mentioned earlier. This allows people to provide bank account information for direct deposit and to also get information on the date when the payment is scheduled to be deposited or mailed and the method. Will it be mailed or will it go into a certain bank account? The IRS is required to mail notices within 15 days after a payment is made to the last known address for the tax filer. So reviewing the notice is another way to track the payment. This does not help if someone's moved, again, because the IRS is going to go with the last address that they have on file. But that notice will include the payment amount, method of delivery, and contact information if someone didn't actually get their payment. And because this is a significant amount of money, there are lots of scams out there. And so we want to be sure to let people know that the IRS is not going to contact someone by phone, text, or email, or post on social media. The IRS does not ask for personal information, especially especially for banking details either. And this money is not something that people need to pay a processing fee for. Some scams say, pay this fee and I can get you your payment quicker. So we want to make sure people know they don't need to spend money to get the payment. And if you hear of any of these scams, you can report them to the Better Business Bureau, and that will help protect others. So lastly, I'm just leaving you with a few resources. The Get It Back campaign has created a landing page where we will be adding resources to it. So these resources are for advocates and for individuals. Right now, for advocates, we have a guide to economic impact payments. It's in a Q&A format, addresses everything that I've shared plus a whole lot more. And we're continuing to update it as we get additional questions. And the IRS has a growing number of resources as well. So I've included some links to some of the pages that you may be interested in. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roxy. And everyone, let me apologize. Roxy had a great presentation with tons of great information, and it looked really awesome when she sent it to me. And then when I copied and pasted into my master PowerPoint, I screwed up the formatting on it. So when we send the slides out to everyone, I'll make sure that I put it back into the original pristine condition that we had it from Roxy. Next up, we have our own Vice President for Programs and Policy, Steve Berg, and he's going to give us an update on federal funding for the COVID-19 crisis. Steve, I'm going to unmute you and you can go ahead.
All right, great. Thanks, Mindy, and thanks Roxy. That was a great presentation, and I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about these individual payments, and I hope we can continue to work with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities to make that happen. So I'm going to talk very briefly about resources that the federal government has already put out to help communities deal with homelessness. People, of course, on this call know that homeless people are incredibly vulnerable to the epidemic, both because they're in situations where the disease will spread easily and because many of the characteristics that are unfortunately too common among homeless people are also common among those who are experiencing the worst outcomes from the epidemic, whether that's race or medical condition or age. What communities need help with, we've found, is dealing with unsheltered homelessness, dealing with people who are sheltered and making sure that shelters are safe for people, including having non-congregate shelters, a lot of hotel rooms being used for that, moving people into housing, diversion prevention, and then a longer term resolution so that we don't get stuck with so there aren't lots and lots of people end up in temporary situations that are then in danger of going back to the streets when the crisis ends. Next slide, please. All right, so the pot of money in the CARES Act that's most directly targeted to homelessness is the ESG funding in the CARES Act. People know the Emergency Solutions Grant is a program that exists now. It's a formula grant to larger cities and counties and also to balance of state for the rest of the state. The usual amount is about $280 million a year. Most of it is subcontracted to nonprofits, and it's used for a range of services for people who are homeless or people at risk of homelessness, including outreach, shelter. Rapid rehousing is often funded through ESG. ESG can be used both for construction and other capital costs and also for operating costs. Next slide, please. The ESG that's in the CARES Act is different in a number of ways from the usual annual ESG that people get. The first is that it's quite a bit more money. The CARES Act provided $4 billion for ESG. You remember I said the usual amount is $280 million a year. So this is around 13 times as much money. Some of the money will go out using the usual ESG formula, and the rest of the money will go out by using a new formula that HUD is in the process of developing that's more closely tied to needs that arise from the coronavirus. HUD has already announced, as people know, the first $1 billion in allocations. You can look on the HUD website and see how much your community or state is getting out of that first $1 billion. And their intention is to release the rest based on this new formula. So it was up to $2 billion in the usual formula, but they are working at releasing that first $1 billion and then doing the other $3 billion under the new formula. So next slide, please. The other category of changes from the CARES Act compared to usual ESG is more flexibility in a number of different ways. There's no matching requirement under the CARES Act ESG. There is no shelter cap. As people know, usually for ESG, only a certain percentage can be used for shelters, and the rest has to be used for other activities like outreach and rental assistance. With this funding, there's no shelter cap. So if your community wants to use the whole thing for shelter, that's okay. If they don't want to use any for shelter, that's okay too. The rule that people have to be placed, if people are placed in rental housing, the rents have to be below the fair market rents. That has been waived by HUD. So if you can't find housing that meets the fair market rent requirement, you can go above that. Although the rule that the rent has to be reasonable is kept. So that leaves a little ambiguity that I'm sure will be addressed as time goes on. I said before, the people who are eligible for help are either people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. The usual ESG program then has a long regulation based on the statute about who's at risk of homelessness. Under the CARES Act ESG, that's very simplified so that anybody with income under 50% of area median is considered at risk of homelessness and is eligible for help from the ESG program. And then there is no treatment or performance requirements allowed for people who are in order to access services that are paid for by this CARES Act ESG. So no sort of requirements that people engage in certain kind of services or they do certain kind of activities. It's very much, you know, an emergency allocation of money and understands that people are in crisis and need to be helped right away. Okay, next slide, please. Some of the important things that the ESG money can be used for is dealing with shelters, helping shelters expand in order to shelter more non-sheltered people, or to deconcentrate the people in the shelters in order to meet CDC guidelines. So a good use of this is non-congregate shelters. The latest FEMA guidelines is FEMA emergency money is much more useful than we may have thought for non-congregate shelters like hotel rooms. So people should go to FEMA first, but then the ESG money is a good way to back that up, pay for different kinds of services to people in hotels. Connecting people with permanent housing, landlord outreach, those aspects of rapid rehousing kinds of programs. You can use ESG. ESG is a good use for that. And then of course, rental assistance up to 2 years. ESG will not pay for a permanent rent subsidy the way that Section 8 will, but it will pay for rental assistance up to 2 years, whether as a way to prevent homelessness or to help people who are homeless get into housing for the time being. Next slide, please. Okay, so some other federal resources besides ESG. The CARES Act also provided $5 billion in CDBG money. CDBG, of course, is an existing program that can be used for a range of different local purposes. So that means more competition. It's not just for homelessness. Communities will be using that for a range of different things, but it can be used for homelessness. One of the things about the CARES Act CDBG, usually there's a limit on how much can be used for public services. So CDBG is mostly thought of as a way to build buildings or buy buildings. And you're only allowed to use 15% for services, other kinds of activities. But in the CARES Act, the public services limit is eliminated. So it can be used for a range of different kinds of things. In terms of rental assistance, the usual rule for CDBG is you can only use it to pay for up to 3 months of rental assistance. HUD is considering changing that. We will find out soon whether they're changing that. Okay, next slide, please. Another big, much larger source of funding is this Coronavirus Relief Fund. That is a payment to states and to larger cities and counties. The total is $150 billion, so that's obviously a lot more money. It is very flexible, can be used for all kinds of things, which means very intense competition at the local level, at the state level, for what this will be spent on. There was just guidance released today that indicated that this Coronavirus Relief Fund money will be able to be used for rental assistance for people who need that. That was clear enough from the statutory language that was very flexible, but the Treasury Department has now confirmed that. People will be receiving that as states and local governments, cities and counties of places with over 500,000 population. Smaller local governments will need to look to the state to get that. Next slide, please. And then just some other important federal resources that are part of the mix that communities are using to deal with homelessness. FEMA, of course, we've already talked about. They're a very good source for dealing with shelters, including the non-congregated shelters, as I said. The health centers, community health centers, including health care for the homeless, have received new money and are very closely tied into working with homeless people. And as Mindy mentioned, we're going to have some additional resources working with them. Medicaid is, of course, the large federal program that pays for healthcare for many, many low-income people. States have more flexibility about getting waivers to use that, so that people should definitely be working with the state Medicaid agency and to local healthcare providers who receive Medicaid, and a lot of times that's the health center. The Paycheck Protection Program is the refundable small business loan program that is getting more money in the bill that Congress is passing today. That program, nonprofits are eligible to apply for that. So homeless providers may want to look at that as a source for improving their own financial stability during this time. And then, of course, Roxy talked about the economic impact payments, and we're working with a lot of people to make sure that homeless people can get those payments and use them for things that they need. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me, before we get to the questions, let me just kick it back to Mindy so she can introduce Jerry Jones.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm going to unmute everyone, and Jerry, Roxy, and Steve, if you could turn your cameras on so everyone can see your beautiful faces. There you all are. Good to see you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started on the Q&A. Lots and lots and lots of questions. And Roxy, there were tons of questions for you, as you can imagine, and we could probably spend the next hour just asking for clarification about the payments. But I want to get started with one this is a very specific question, but I think it's something that will probably come up with lots of folks. Is there any guidance from you all or someone else in the policy field about survivors of domestic violence who may have filed jointly with their abusive partners but are now separated or divorced? So the check maybe went to an address or a bank account that was belonging to the abusive partner.
Yes, this is a very good question, and it is something that I've been hearing and still getting some guidance from the IRS about what is it that people can do in that situation. So I will be following up and definitely updating the FAQs as soon as we have something solid to share. Right now, it's not clear about what the process would be once that payment has already been distributed. What are the options for someone to get it in that situation? So I will follow up on that one.
Great, thank you. We will look for that. And again, everyone, these slides will be available after the webinar, and they will be available in the original format that Roxy sent them to me in. So again, I will make sure that I fix that. So you'll be able to click on that link and follow along as the Center on Budget updates that information. Before we move on to a question for our policy folks, maybe a couple more questions for you, Roxy. And I think this is true not just for people that are working with clients, but for a lot of us just who our friends have found this. Most of the folks that we work with have received a payment status not available from the IRS website when they go to check it. Any updates on what's going on with the IRS website? It doesn't seem like anybody's been able to get good information on that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons why someone may receive that notice. And I know just yesterday, someone was checking it out and they got that message, but then someone else who used it was able to successfully use it. So the site does work, but sometimes there are some delays in when as the IRS is updating certain information for people. So the best advice really is to just try again the next day. Trying multiple times during the same day, they only update the site once in the evening. So that's not going to do much for you, but to keep checking it the next day. And there is a link on the IRS site with explaining like some of the reasons why someone may getting that error message. So I can add that as part of the follow-up for you to share, Mindy.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, so Steve and Jerry, Alliance policy folks, lots and lots of questions on federal funding. I think I want to ask you, Steve, to get started with just You mentioned briefly CDBG. We get a lot of questions about CDBG, and I think it's maybe a lot of the folks in the fields, especially at the program level, don't really understand this funding stream and how it usually works out in communities, who controls it, how does my program go about getting CDBG funding. So Steve, could you or Jerry just give us a general overview again of CDBG, how folks might have been touching it before and ways that they can maybe advocate for getting that for people experiencing homelessness now?
Yeah, I can give a general overview. One thing, let me say, as is true with ESG, the way CDBG will be administered and what it will be used for under the CARES Act is probably going to be somewhat different than the usual way it's received. So all these are, the detailed questions are very good, and it's probably a good idea to wait until HUD puts out the guidance and the money just to be sure, because there's a lot of waivers they're considering and talking about, but they haven't done it yet. But CDBG, as I said, in general, is something communities get every year. It's usually, it's a formula grant that goes to larger local governments and also to state governments. It's usually used for building things. It's thought of, the D stands for development. So it's usually thought of as a development thing for the communities used to build buildings. The CDBG that's in the CARES Act is a little more flexible than that. As I said, the usual rules that sort of require most of it to be spent for capital costs have been relaxed here, so it's usable for a whole range of different services, and it's usually the state or local. There's usually a community development department that implements that, and they'll probably be the first ones to look to for what to do with the CDBG that's coming through the CARES Act. I want to introduce Jerry just so people get a chance to know him. Jerry is in charge of the Alliance's field outreach on grassroots advocacy, and I think he is important for people to know in terms of, like, we're talking a lot about money that's already on the table, but the other piece of this is that Congress is going to be considering more. So can I turn it over to you, Jerry, for just a moment?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I joined the Alliance in January after 5 years of coalition building in Los Angeles with homeless service providers and supportive housing developers. And prior to that, I was the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. I first began working on homelessness issues more than 30 years ago, and my mentor and first boss really in homelessness advocacy was a fellow named Mitch Snyder, who among other things led a vigil on Capitol Hill with many others and a national campaign to win the Stuart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act. He and other advocates literally slept on a heat grate on Capitol Hill and advocated for 5.5 months through the dead of winter to win what we now know as the federal funding called McKinney-Vento. So I was considerably younger back then, but I'm grateful to have had the chance to march and sit in and lobby with Mitch and to be active in those early years of the homelessness crisis. And I'm glad to be at the Alliance now. I joined in January, which, as it turns out, was a critical time because we now know that's when this pandemic began, and we recognize the urgency of a federal response to help those who are homeless, as well as the millions of people who are now on the brink of homelessness because of coronavirus. And so there is no city or town or county in the country that on its own has the resources to deal with a pandemic of this magnitude. And so I wanted to both introduce myself and then to underscore how much we need all of our field partners in advocacy efforts now, that in the same way that each of our organizations has to tend to fundraising and cultivating individual donors or staying on top of the latest program models and interventions to serve people better, or the other, just management tasks of keeping our organizations running, we also need to devote the time and attention to getting our mayors and members of Congress and county officials and others to step up like never before. And that's not always an easy task. So next week, the National Alliance is hosting on Thursday, the 30th, at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, a webinar that will focus on effective advocacy during a pandemic. And I'll be joined by Steve Piasecki, who is with the Supportive Housing Network of New York, and Dora Gallo, who's the president and CEO of a Community of Friends in Los Angeles. Steve is an expert in how do you build bipartisan statewide coalitions. And in fact, the main reason we have a bipartisan coalition of members of Congress who are supporting more funding for homelessness in Washington is because Steve and the Supportive Housing Network got Representative John Katko of the 24th District in New York to join with Representative Gwen Moore and other Democrats to push for more funding. And then Representative Katko brought other Republicans on as well. And Dora Gallo from Los Angeles has played a critical role in winning $5 billion in new homelessness funding on the local level through Prop HHH and Measure H, which has resulted in a dramatic expansion of LA's homeless response system. She's also, in addition to having run, she's been running one of the leading organizations on homelessness in Los Angeles. Dora was the former chief of staff to one of the city council members in Los Angeles. And LA City Hall, I've learned a lot from Dora about that den of politicians, which is as murky and complicated as any I've encountered in Los Angeles. She's been fighting the good fight in understanding how to win homelessness resources in those halls of power. So we're grateful that they can join us and share insights into how your organizations can also leverage new resources on homelessness on the local level as well as on the national level, and we'll be on the webinar as well on Thursday to give lay out our strategy on how we can advocate to win the federal resources we need. Thanks, Steve.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Guys, we have some questions, some FEMA related questions. So I think more and more folks are learning about FEMA funding Category B being able to be used for non-congregate shelter. But there's a little confusion about, Steve, you talked about FEMA funding being used first and then transferring to HUD. Some folks have heard from some folks at FEMA that HUD should go first and then FEMA. So can you clarify that? And then also had some questions about whether or not that FEMA funding can be used for hazard pay.
Yeah, so FEMA it is really important to get your state government involved if you want to deal with FEMA, because FEMA deals with governor's offices, and it's the governor's office who's got to call them in and make the arrangements. So and I think, you know what, just how the arrangement that the state of California just announced the other day is typical of that. And North Carolina is doing something similar, and other states are doing it. So it's got to be through the governor's office. That's the best way to do it. Again, it depends, the precise details depend on what arrangement the governor's office and FEMA are able to work out. So it's sort of hard to say, you know, there's any hard and fast rules because there aren't. But for the most part, the agreements that FEMA and states have made about funding non-congregate shelter for homeless people, it's sort of like, yeah, the FEMA is paying the hotel bills, and then the ESG money can use to be paid for other sort of things associated to like that, like services like landlord outreach. I think people looking at California's model is a good thing to look at in terms of how FEMA should be used. And then what was the other? Hazard pay. Again, I mean, so the ESG money is a good thing to use for it. Paying staff is an important part of what ESG does. So hazard pay is good for that. It is possible to use FEMA for that, but again, it's got to be worked out between the governor's office and FEMA about what the precise details of what FEMA is going to pay for are.
Great, thank you, Steve. Roxy, we have a couple of more questions for you. Had some questions early on about folks who have representative payees. So who gets the checks for those folks?
So if this is someone who is receiving like some type of benefits and has the representative payee, the payment will go to wherever the benefits are going. So if that's an account that is maintained by the representative payee, then that's where the payment will go. It will be, my understanding is that it's based on how the method that the payments, the method that the benefits are already being distributed.
Okay, that makes sense. And a follow-up question particularly for those folks, and this may be a little too weedy, but let's say someone had already started their SSDI application before the coronavirus, but they haven't received the award yet. Should they use a non-filers link?
Yes, they'll need to use the non-filers link. They aren't in the system for automatic payments if their application hasn't been, if they're still in the process of applying for benefits.
Great. Okay, and one more question for you, Roxy. This person has heard that IRS will work with the VA for veterans that get service-connected compensation so that they will receive payments automatically. And they want to know if you can confirm that. And then also, what about those veterans that receive non-service connected pensions?
So that's a question I'll have to follow up on. I need to get some more information on that.
Great, thank you. Okay, Steve and Jerry, we have just one more question. We're at 4 o'clock, but I wanted to get one more question in there about everyone's hearing about the waivers and the mega waiver and all of that stuff. Can you guys just talk about what you think the most important waivers are for people to know about, especially for people who are experiencing homelessness for COC, ESG, and HOPWA during the pandemic? And also just explain a little bit about like what the process is for getting something waived in this special situation.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, like as I was talking about with the ESG program, there's ways in which the money that comes through the CARES Act is different than the regular money through that program. Some of the changes were made right in the law when Congress passed the money. Some of them are things that HUD has done waivers on. So there's a number of things, like for example, I talked about you can pay more than the fair market rent if you're using your ESG for rental assistance. That's because of a waiver, and HUD, on HUD's website is guidance for how to use that waiver. You don't have to ask for a waiver and wait for HUD to respond. You just send in a notice that you're going to take advantage of that waiver, and then you do it. And then the regular waiver process still exists. So you're finding there's a particular rule for ESG that's causing problems using it in the community, you can, the grantee of the funds, so for ESG, it would be the state or local government. For Section 8, it would be a housing authority, can request a waiver from HUD through the usual process. And HUD has been clear that waivers needed to deal with the coronavirus will be treated in an expedited way. So hopefully the answers will be back quickly.
Great, thank you. Okay, we are over time. Thanks to everyone for attending today's webinar. Please don't forget about the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council webinar town hall conversation tomorrow. The slides will be available to you and we'll have the link for that. We will be following up on all the questions we weren't able to get to today with our experts from the webinar on our forum and with you directly. Thanks, everyone.